Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code Locked On NBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's show, who's the starting shooting guard for the Milwaukee Bucks? There's a couple of internal candidates. Is there one externally? We get into that conversation next.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis, and we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find us on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Camille, we're, I suppose at this point, left to assume there are going to be no major changes by way of trades to the Bucks roster. So let's assume there's no Brook Lopez trade. We've already gone over that ad nauseum. And you feel pretty good about, you got four guys locked into the starting lineup. That leads us to the big question, who starts at shooting guard? So there's four internal candidates we're going to spend some time looking at, and then potential for one external. But let's just rip the Band-Aid off. We can get into the whys. Who makes the most sense to you?
At this point, like, it's interesting because I've gone through it in my head a few times and I've landed on DeLon Wright, which sounds weird when I say it out loud, because when I saw the signing come through initially, I was like, what a great rotational piece. Like, that's going to be great depth for the Bucks. And that was my first thought. Like I mentioned before, when we talked about his signing on Locked On Bucks a few weeks ago, when it was first announced, where I was like, he has made a career of being a bench guy for the most part. He's had some spot starts and some stops along the way, but for the most part throughout his career, he has come off the bench. He's played in over 500 games and he started in 85 of them. So like, that's just been his career so far. So my initial thought was, well, that's what he's been doing. That is what he will continue to do. But I think the more I've thought about it, the more I was like, he really actually might start here in Milwaukee because his skill set, it just fits next to Dame of what we are looking for. I shouldn't say we and assume that you feel the same way, but I would love just to have it that starting two guard spot, somebody who can take on that toughest, offensive assignment so that Dame doesn't have to be exerted in that way. Last season, Malik Beasley was miscast in that role. And I just feel like we've seen the tape on DeLon, right? We know he can do that. And he shoots well enough where it's like, teams probably aren't going to be terrified of him from three or anything like that, but he can knock it down about 37% last year. So he can shoot the ball well enough. And I just think that he fits a lower usage player who can have the ball in his hands as well sometimes. And then also you can, do the staggering, maybe take him off the floor first, bring him back in with the bench, so on and so forth. But just thinking about the options that are currently on the team now, I think that DeLon Wright is actually where I'm leaning to, which, as I mentioned, surprised me because when I first saw the signing, I just thought of him as a bench guy. But the more I think about it, the more him starting next to Dame with Chris, with Giannis, and with Brook makes sense to me.
In terms of skill set, I agree with you on that. So would you say he's the best fit of all those candidates? And let's just clear up any confusion. The candidates that we're referring to, obviously DeLon Wright, Marjon Beauchamp, I think you have to throw out there, even though you probably view him more as more of a three. Andre Jackson Jr., AJ Green is one that picked up a lot of steam last year. And then I suppose the dark horse ones that we could bring up, everybody's favorite. Pat Connaughton, you read my mind. And you and I talked about this the other day too, Chris Middleton, if that technically meant that Taurean Prince, who is now official, by the way, as a Buck, Taurean Prince starts and you slide Chris Middleton down to the two guard. I don't know about you. I'm willing to cross those last two off the list. I don't think Pat Connaughton is going to start at two guard. We went over it. You can find in the previous episode reasons why it might be not so wise to do that with Chris Middleton. So those two I'm going to cross off. The DeLon Wright one, he probably is the best fit for what his skill set is, what you need that position to be. I suppose the one area I would push back and say, what about this? Does this give you any concern? Is I think we're led to assume Damian Lillard is probably going to play all of the first quarter, the bulk of the first quarter. I know Doc Rivers changed that a little bit, but the bulk of the first quarter. And you mentioned it too. DeLon Wright would theoretically be one of the first ones to leave the floor. Then you bring in a shooter or someone else. My only hesitation with it is a couple of things. Number one, I know it's not quite as important because technically DeLon Wright would fill this role as well. But who's your backup point guard at that point? So who's going to run the offense? DeLon Wright could still do that. But also, as crazy as it sounds, I do wonder if you start DeLon Wright, if that doesn't maximize the minutes that you have him with Damian Lillard, if that makes sense.
So when you think about maximizing the fit with him, is it more so about which piece of it are you wondering, like if it maximizes it, like the offense of him or like the defense?
More just the raw minutes on the floor with Dame, because if you do that, he's going to leave the game before Damian Lillard, I would assume, and then he'll come in to replace Damian Lillard. Whereas if you started somebody else, and let's just say AJ Green, I'm not advocating that, but we'll say AJ Green starts. 4 minutes pass, you bring in DeLon Wright to take his spot, and Damian Lillard plays with him for the remainder of the quarter or pretty close to it. Then Dame exits and DeLon Wright stays out there. He's your point guard running the offense, where you're able to grab more of those minutes. And it almost feels like if you started him, it would be a little more spotty, where it would be closer to 1-on, 1-off.
That's fair. I think that's fair. And to your point, I do think if they do go in this direction with DeLon Wright starting, then we were like, oh, that's a great backup combo guard to have. Now it's like, well, now, as you said, who is that backup point guard? Do we see more Andre Jackson with ball handling, like initiating offense? We know that was something he did in college. Didn't see it as much in the NBA. And that's something that he mentioned himself of having to get used to, of playing off ball quite a bit more. Is it a thing where it's like when Dame's off the floor, now we start getting kind of funky in the sense of the offense is running through Chris or it's running through Giannis and they're initiating it more often. And there's like a nominal point guard on the floor just to kind of guard the other team's point guard, or also just have some secondary ball handling next to a Chris or a Giannis. And then to your point about just the staggering, and then this could be like, okay, well, DeLon Wright, then you're doing a little bit of both. But I do think if you go that route, then the Bucks probably should look to use that 15 spot on just another guard to bring in to kind of help with that off the bench production. So like that would be one of the things for me where like it would actually change how I view what they should do with that 15 spot, because I've been saying go for it big, go for it. Precious Achiuwa. B-Ball Paul is gone now. He got claimed by
it's just Precious Achiuwa.
Yes, it's Precious now. So like if that's the guy, like that's been the big who I'm looking like, okay, let's get him into the rotation. But if Wright is starting, then the Bucks then do have another need for another ball handler.
Yeah, and look, it may just be as simple as supply and demand, and what's out there, what isn't out there. Maybe the Bucks do need a big more than they would need another secondary creator and ball handler. But if there's none out there, that may just shift how their focus is for the remainder of free agency, however long that is. There's two names we didn't really get into too much about who could be starting at two guard, the young guys. So we'll take a look at that coming up here after the break. And then we mentioned, is there an external candidate out there? There's some murmurs that have just refused to go away for one player that has some ties to Damian Lillard. We will get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you about our friends over at Game Time. We all love taking in Major League Baseball games during the offseason. It's the summertime. That's what the summer was for. Catching up on baseball, sharing some fond memories with those that you take to the game, maybe even traveling and crossing some new ballparks off of your list. When you do that, you maybe haven't been to that city or that ballpark before, and that's where Game Time comes in as the perfect app for taking in your summer baseball. Not only do they have last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% off when you buy at the last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. They also have flash deals where you can save exclusively in the app on select seats ahead of the game or event. But you can also see the view from your seat, which is very important and very helpful when it's a stadium or arena you have not been to before. You see the all-in pricing, so there is no sticker shock once you get to that final checkout screen. And you even get the best price guarantee, the lowest price there is. If you can find seats for a cheaper price, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And it all comes with that purchase guarantee, the Game Time ticket coverage, your purchase covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So while you're out there taking in your baseball games, your events, whatever it is, take the guesswork out of buying those tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA. Use that code for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So those other two names, Camille, Andre Jackson Jr. and MarJon Beauchamp, we mentioned is probably more of a three. I think MarJon, we could probably lump into that, probably a long shot as well. But just going off of the way Doc Rivers spoke about him at the end of the season, the way John Horst and company spoke about him when he was drafted, I do think we should at least consider him in this spot. Looking at Ajax, let's start with him. Last year, we did get a chance to see him playing the two guard quite a bit. And in those minutes where Andre Jackson Jr. was on the floor at the two guard specifically, would you believe if I told you the Bucks offense in those lineups was in the 99th percentile? Their defense was even worse with Andre Jackson Jr. on the floor at two guard than it was their overall full year defensive rating numbers, all of it 134.7 defensive rating. Now, granted, it was about 250 lineups, possessions, I should say, that we saw him on the floor there, but the exact opposite that I think most Bucks fans would have assumed of, man, the offense was even better, the defense was even worse.
Yeah, you would have thought because of what Ajax projects as, right? We think of Andre Jackson Jr. as that defensive stopper, that switchable, versatile defender who can come out there and make some things happen with the rebounding, with the screening, so on and so forth. So I did not expect for that defensive rating. You said 134 while he was the
34.7. Now, we should add this caveat. The lineups that we saw him utilize the most as a two guard were with those other four names that we mentioned and asked who's going to be the fifth starter. So if the Bucks rolled that out as their starting five, that was the grouping that Ajax played in the most as a two guard. And in those lineups with Brooke, Giannis, Chris Middleton, and Damian Lillard, offensive rating 136.7, defensive rating 113.8. So defensive number even better than their full season number. And look, as we talked about a bit last year, 113.8, you're right in that neighborhood of, yeah, that's good enough. So limited, not the most, but it was the most he played as a two guard, and those numbers held up pretty well.
And that's what I was going to ask, like, what's the lineup that was used with that? Because it was, like you said, super surprising to hear that. But I think there's a case for Andre Jackson Jr. as well, especially if that 3-point shot that we were seeing, again, a real funky shot that he has. It is not a work of art when you watch him shoot it, but he was making it a bit more than I thought, shooting 37% from three on a very, very low volume, not even a 3-pointer a game type of low volume when we're talking about that number. But that's something he's going to have to do in that position as well. Like, of course, the defense is very important. As I said, that's what I'm looking for as like the best type of player to slot next to Dame, someone who can pick up that toughest offensive assignment on defense night in and night out. But you have to also make sure that teams respect you enough from three. So if that's real, even if it's not 37% and he's shooting 35% from three, just if you're open, because you're going to see a lot of open shots when you're on the court with Dame and with Chris and with Giannis and Brooke too, just because that's where the offense attention is going to be. So if he can put that together along with the defense, and for him defensively, he just kind of has to continue to grow into that. I think a lot of the fouling problems that he had last year were partly just rookie needing to learn, a little bit overzealous, understanding how the game is called, the pace of the game, so on and so forth. And some of the calls, I thought they were just kind of like rookie calls, like people who have a reputation of being good defenders wouldn't have gotten some of the calls that he got, but you're a rookie. You got to earn that. So if he can also put that piece together, I think there's an argument for it, but we're talking about Andre Jackson Jr. in like an ideal sense. Like we don't know what the development looks like yet at this point, which is why I still would go right over Jackson at the moment. But like, I would love to hear in training camp that he's just killing everything. There's no choice but to play him. But there is some improvement that's going to have to be made, I think, for him to slide into that spot.
Conversely, when we look at MarJon, he in that same grouping, again, very limited. It was only about 30 possessions that we saw MarJon Beauchamp as the two guard with Brooke Lopez, Giannis, Chris Middleton, and Damian Lillard. They had a negative 4.5 net rating in those lineups. Offense, again, still pretty good, 135.5, but the defense, a 140 defensive rating in those situations where he actually shined the most. And I think we're going to see a decent amount of these lineups this season was when he played alongside Andre Jackson. And you had Brooke, Giannis, Ajax, Damian Lillard, and MarJon Beauchamp on the floor together. MarJon was technically the 2 in those lineups, and Ajax was the 3. They were a plus 37.6 net rating, a 103 defensive rating. And again, the super large asterisk of, look, it was only about 40 possessions that this occurred. But, we talked about this a couple of times already in the offseason and late last year. There's no denying it, whether it was just, hey, there's another young guy that I get to play with. There was just something there in those moments where Andre Jackson Jr. and MarJon Beauchamp were on the floor together.
Yeah, it was like, I can't remember which 2K it was. It's an older 2K, the one that had Michael B. Jordan in it in the My Career storyline, but it was like a orange juice duo. Like when you were on the court with this Michael B. Jordan character, your stats went up. Like you just had the synergy together. You were dynamic teammates. And that's how it was for MarJon and Ajax last year. To your point, they even said like, we like playing together because like pretty much we go to war together. I know I have another young guy out here with me in the same position as me, fighting for the same things. Like they just kind of feed off of each other in that way. But MarJon is the guy of the group where he's not talked about as much because last season was really strange for him and he had the back spasms to end the year. So he didn't get a chance as some of the other young guys, AJ Green and Ajax, to get on the court as much. So limited MarJon down the stretch under Doc. But I think of all the young guys, he's like the best blend of defense and offense projection wise. Like he just seems like he'd have the best blend of what you're looking for from offense and on that defensive side. It's just that on court, seeing the defense itself, it hasn't looked how I thought that it would necessarily. But again, if there is some internal improvement here from MarJon, like he's going to have a case for this as well, because he's somebody who shot 40% from 3 last year. Again, the volume wasn't super high for him, a little under 2 3-point attempts a game, but he was knocking it down at a higher clip than he was in his rookie year. Although his rookie year, he got up a couple more, still a smaller sample size, 2.3 3-point attempts his rookie year, 1.6 in his sophomore season here. But there's potential with MarJon here. And I feel like we're getting to year 3 of MarJon. So this is the year where it's like, if you don't see it,
we got to see
then
something.
It's time
this
to really start having conversations. Yeah.
There's one last name internally we didn't spend too much time on, maybe the most solid of those names when we talk about fit, maybe upside. Sure, there is some, but I think the previous 2 names we mentioned in Andre and MarJon bring you the bigger piece of upside, but maybe the most solid fit is that name that we've yet to address. And again, oh, by the way, is there an external candidate to join this team as the presumably starting 2 guard? We'll get into that conversation next on Locked On Bucks. And as a reminder, if you find yourself watching ESPN and Fox Sports all day, but constantly having to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, it means it's time to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that is programmed for you every day, bringing you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, Camille, that last name is AJ Green. And again, it was about 500 to 600 possessions that we saw AJ Green out there as the 2 guard. A lot of that came late in the season when he really seemed to win over Doc Rivers. Trust, I should say, in that, hey, this guy's holding up defensively. And I think the numbers, again, we can't emphasize this enough. It's an extremely small sample size for all of these guys. So add that caveat and take that as you will. But the numbers for AJ Green in those moments where he played the 2 guard, to me, really line up with the eye test as well. And they're probably the most solid, where overall offensive rating better. It was under a 130, just under a 130. A defensive rating, again, a 113.8, which same number or close to it we referenced with Ajax and said it should be good enough if you get that offense to where it is. And I think that's kind of been the story of AJ Green. You mentioned that MarJon is probably the best blend of offense and defense. Ajax is clearly the best defender. But the shooting of AJ Green is the single best trait of any of those guys. As good as the defense is from Ajax, the fouls piece is the big one. If he can clean that up, then it's a conversation. But that shooting is elite, and we saw the defense be good enough to keep him on the floor, and I think that's what those numbers tell us.
Yeah. I mentioned the numbers of MarJon and Andre Jackson Jr., what they were shooting from 3, and you look at AJ Green, and he shot 41% from 3 his first 2 years in the league on around, I believe, 3 attempts a game, somewhere in there. Yeah, 3 on the dot for AJ Green. So even like the volume, like we know AJ Green could probably get up more if he had more playing time, because he is not gun shy when it comes to getting that shot up. And we have seen him also start taking some of those really deep threes as well. Like the range for AJ Green, the shooting is a real NBA talent that he has there. And the defense has been better than what we thought. Not saying he's a lockdown guy or anything like that, but he's not somebody who you're on the floor and like, we got to hide him all over the place. Like he's going to stay in front of his man. He's going to play pretty smart. And like you mentioned, he just he's the more offensive guy, so to speak, when it comes to that skill set. Although I don't feel like the creation is necessarily the same as a MarJon, where he kind of gets his shots. Although we were seeing AJ Green last year start taking a few more mid-range shots, and I was really interested in that as part of his development.
We saw shots inside the arc, that I think initially you thought, whoa, what are you doing here? Like, we have you out there to shoot threes, but he clearly got more comfortable with it.
And that's a good trait to have, because as you continue to build your reputation as a knockdown three-point shooter, the game plan is going to be run you off the line. And if you get ran off the line, what is your counter move? So if you have a mid-range game that you feel comfortable with, when you're ran off the line, you can pull up, that's going to be really beneficial. And he's also a smart player. Like, if he doesn't have the shot, he passes the ball. So AJ Green is somebody who I definitely see in the rotation, as we have heard all summer so far, that he will be part of the rotation. But I think he has a case to start as well. I'm going to still go with Wright, but like what AJ Green brings with his shooting ability, that's real. And if he can still shoot 40% or high 30% on a higher volume of threes, like 5-6 threes a game, like that's going to be really big for the Bucks.
And I mean, that's just product of being a coach's kid. When you talk about if he doesn't have the shot, he passes and finds the right shot for his teammates. I remember there was a game last year where he had a 4-point play, and afterwards he was our post-game interview, and I jokingly asked him, hey, when's the last time you had a 4-point play? And just immediately dismissively, like, I had them all the time in high school. Like, oh, okay. I didn't give my answer yet. I would say Ajax at this point is who I would lean on and say, you got to win the job.
Yeah.
But this is who I would put in position to say, okay, doors open. Let's see if you can win this job to be our starting 2-guard. Just because, I mean, everybody called for it last year. You could see there's something there defensively with Andre Jackson. Also, to your point of rookie fouls and things of that nature, I don't think they're totally going to go away because he is aggressive in nature, but you do wonder how much that diminishes in year number 2, and he can certainly offset some of those issues. I don't want to paint it in a bad light, but he can offset some of those things you'd run into with Damian Lillard defensively and pick up multiple positions, and just the overall injection of energy and youth that we saw in those minutes he was on the floor. I think your goal should be to get as many minutes for Andre Jackson Jr. as you can this upcoming season. And, as we've talked about, he's almost like a Swiss Army knife for the Bucks. Yeah. He could be a backup point guard. He was really one of the only guys, especially the games without Damian Lillard, you felt comfortable handling the ball and bringing it up the floor in that Pacers series. He can take on threes defensively. We saw him technically almost playing like a 4 at times too. So for me, he's the guy that I would say, look, all you guys, these 3 young guys we focused on, you got a chance to win this job, but I really kind of hope it's you, Andre, would be my approach. And if I was Doc Rivers and the rest of the coaching staff. So we wrap up here. I mentioned there's one external possibility. So scale of 1 to 10, Camille, how much stock do you put in all of those murmurs to, hey, Gary Trent Jr., he's got a relationship with Dame. Dame's reached out to him.
Now, shout out to Dame if that is true. Like, you're doing your job, sir. You are doing
a lot of work if he's recruiting Haywood Highsmith and Gary Trent Jr.
And I'm happy to hear it. I'm happy to hear it. And Gary Trent, like that situation with him is just so strange because it's like the Raptors put out an offer for him that was like, I think 15 million annually or something like that. And then they pulled it off the table and he was looking to get like 25 million annually. But now they're not sure how the market's going to shake out for him. So he could be a candidate of somebody who ends up playing for less this year than what he was looking for, and maybe less than what the Raptors were even offering him initially at this point in free agency. I just don't know if a guy who was looking for 25 million had 15 on the table, if he is going to accept a vet min, even if that means like, hey, you can boost your status. We know all the things that come with taking a 1-year bet on yourself. And I would love for him to take that bet here in Milwaukee. If it happens, I will be genuinely shocked that he signed on a minimum contract, just given what he was looking for. And he's probably the most talented guy that's left on the market right now. I would think that he would command more than a vet man at this point, even for a 1-year deal. Like we saw Malik Beasley at least get $6 million for the 1 year, where it's like, all right, you didn't get a big payday, but you doubled your salary from last year at the very least. This will be a pay cut for Gary Trent Jr. though.
Yeah, other teams can offer more. The Bucks just have the vet minimum available, and we saw that's what kind of bit them with the Haywood Highsmith move. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned how strange the market has been, and we briefly touched on this on yesterday's show, but I mean, it's as simple to me as, man, the Clippers really caused these seismic shifts in the NBA by just sticking in their heels and saying, you know what, we'll pay James Harden. We draw the line at paying you, Paul George, because we all assumed Paul George was going to remain in Los Angeles, and the Clippers did not have money to be spenders in free agency with the assumption that Paul George was staying there. The Sixers did. So if Paul George stayed in Los Angeles, that opens up money for a number of other players. Caleb Martin goes there on a cheap deal. Maybe he stays in Miami because the Sixers spend money on, let's say, KCP, who got it anyway, ultimately, or even Gary Trent Jr. But there was just so few teams that had money. And when one of those got the biggest fish that was out there, that basically ended their big spending for them and just forced a lot of these guys to say, okay, do I take the deal with the Pistons? Do I take the deal with this team? Or do I take a prove-it deal? So that remains to be seen with Gary Trent Jr., if that is what he would be open to, taking one of those prove-it deals and then cashing in eventually next season. So, teams like the Bucks, hey, even potentially teams like the Sixers, who still have some assets to offload as well. But those are the types of teams that are probably going to be kicking the tires hardest now. And Gary Trent Jr., seeing that the market, at least for what he was looking for, has basically shrunk.
Yeah. And if he did end up in Milwaukee, I think that he would come here as the starting shooting guard, even though the defense isn't there, so on and so forth, of what I was talking about, what I'm looking for. And,
that's interesting because, yes, I would largely agree, but I do recall early in his career, he was a pretty good two-way player. And, the last couple of years, it shifted just towards Gary Trent Jr. as a chucker, and he's a guy that's out there scoring. But early on, there was some defense there. So it would potentially be a matter of, all right, can we get some of that back here?
Hey, maybe a situation where it's like in where he's been in with Toronto and whatnot, it's like I've had to be the offensive guy. I haven't had, chance to really even play defense because my load is here on offense. So maybe it's a situation where you do come to a team with Dame, and he has some history of playing with Dame. You play with Dame, you have Chris, you have Giannis, so on and so forth, and you understand, like, I don't have to carry this heavy of offensive load. Let me focus a little bit more on this defense as well. Maybe that does happen, and then the defense is better than what we've seen over the last few years. But again, if it is Trent starting, then you do have right off the bench, you have AJ, like all the things that we've just talked about of why these other guys make good fits starting. Then you have them in the rotation as well coming in the bench. So you could have just change of pace plays. Like, because you start a game doesn't mean you have to finish a game. However the game plays out can dictate that. If the matchups dictate a different, change of pace, then you could go that way as well. But yeah, if Trent signed here on the minimum, again, I'd be very shocked, but I do think he would come in here as the starting shooting guard at that point.
Yeah, and I think, anybody that's watched the two of them, I don't mean this as a slight or any sign of disrespect, but Gary Trent Jr. would be an upgrade from Malik Beasley too. Mm-hmm. That it's, you could say, well, hey, Malik did the same thing. Gary Trent Jr. is a more skilled offensive player. There's more than just catch and shoot as it was with Malik. Anytime Malik put the ball on the floor, it was always an adventure. And there is more defense there than there was with Malik Beasley. So remains to be seen. And that's really the last big question left out there for the Bucks, assuming there's no major moves made. And by major, I mean Brooke Lopez, especially, who starts at 2 guard, and is there a chance that it could be Gary Trent Jr.? We are still waiting on the Summer League roster, so I anticipate we're going to get that within the next day or so. Once we do get that, we'll spend some time poring over that and taking a look at the Summer League slate for the Bucks, because it begins this weekend. So that'll be our next view on tomorrow's show. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.